Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our weekly Friday Lunch and Learn, where we explore environmental topics here in Iowa that are happening right now in the news or just other special places that we really need to talk about so that we can protect them. And that's what we're going to talk about today is the Loess Hills. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the Loess Hills, but maybe you don't know a lot about it. But it's a really unique landform here in Iowa that provides us a lot of benefits, and it's important to protect it. And today we're joined with David Hofer, and he's an expert on tallgrass prairies and the Loess Hills. And I'm going to let him introduce himself here in just a minute, but he's going to tell us a little bit more about the Loess Hills. Maybe that will inspire you to take a trip out there and make sure we're advocating to protect special places in the state like this. So as usual, before we get started, make sure that you are sharing this video far and wide so that we can get this information out. And we'll take some questions at the very end. So you can put those in the Facebook chat or on Zoom if you're watching on Zoom. And we'll get to those questions. And if you leave a question after we're no longer live, we will post the answer in the comments. So with that, I am going to pass this over to David Hofer. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and why you care about the Loess Hills?
Sure. Thank you for having me on today. I'm Dave Hofer. I'm the chair of the biology department at Briarcliff University here in Sioux City, and I'm a professor of biology and environmental science. So my background is definitely environmental science, studying how people can actually live rightly on the landscape with other species to not only preserve the remaining natural habitats, but also to restore habitats as well, so that there can be even more biodiversity on the landscape. Maybe even instill an ethic that it's better to drive down the road to your house and see a fox cross than it is to see strip malls on one side and housing developments on the other.
Right.
A little bit about the Loess Hills. I grew up in Cedar Rapids, so I grew up in eastern Iowa, and growing up, I didn't hear hardly anything about the Loess Hills. And so when I got the job opportunity and accepted it out here in Sioux City, that's when I really began to learn about the Loess Hills and about their uniqueness. Loess is it's a type of pulverized rock. It's been called rock flour. It's very finely ground rock because of the glaciers. And so after our last glaciation, there was a period of time, and it may have been for 1,000 years or more, maybe several thousand years, where there were winds that would blow in different directions that eventually formed these hills that are in the 7 counties along the western border of Iowa and a little bit down into northwestern Missouri. Loess, because of glacial periods in Earth's history, is a common type of soil that's found in soils around the world. But what it does not do is form hills and valleys, the type of geological topography that we have out here. There's only one other place in the world where it does, and that's the Loess Plateau of China. So from that standpoint, this is a geological gem, if you will. And that's one of the reasons that I love the Loess Hills, but I think we'll get into the biology of it a little bit more, and that's what I'm more interested in.
Yeah. Really, thank you so much for the introduction. That's a really good overview of something that we need to protect here in Iowa, because we always think that we're just this crossover state, flyover state, whatever you want to call it, but we actually have some pretty incredible things here in Iowa. We're water rich, we've got Loess Hills, we've got Northeast Iowa driftless region, and a lot more. So let's dig into the Loess Hills. I was doing a little research into the Loess Hills and learned just how unique the topography is and how it was formed. Tell us a little bit more about how it was created, and I was reading a lot about how it was stabilized too, and it wasn't stable until trees grew.
Right, yeah, trees, and then the prairie grasses came in and tended to stabilize everything. Well, I mean, think of it as really fine sand. So what stabilizes the sand? Well, we might have people that live, maybe around the dunes region of one of the Great Lakes, especially Lake Michigan. The dunes become stabilized when dune grasses and et cetera come in, and it's the roots that actually stabilize the area. What we can see up here now is there are many road cuts through Loess, and if you cut it straight down, it seems to stand up but any water hits it and all of a sudden then it just starts to just fall apart. It's highly erodible soils, maybe more so certainly more so than topsoil, more so than a lot of soils that people might be thinking about or might be used to. And this is because, again, it is so finely ground and it was blown in on centuries of wind. And there were apparently periods where, it was very windy and the loess was blown in, after the glaciers retreated. And then, of course, it was fairly, stable for a while. And then another period of loess being blown in. And it created these hills that now, after the trees came in and after the prairies came in, it's the roots, the biological matter, when they die, they add that rich organic content that the topsoils need. And then even more plants were able to become established here. And then eventually, over time, we had topsoil put on top of the loess itself. That topsoil is incredibly rich, and of course, it is farmed everywhere now. But historically, the tops of the hills were prairie, and then the forests were down in the valleys, usually where the rivers and the creeks were.
Interesting. Interesting. So the Loess Hills have been called a biological crossroads where, the easternmost species and the westernmost species live. Explain that a little bit more. What does that mean and why is that
Sure.
really interesting?
It's really interesting because if you think about it, you go out to Nebraska, you go into South Dakota, it tends to get drier. South Dakota still has a decent amount of tall grass prairie because tall grass needs more rain. But when you're getting a little bit further west toward the Rockies, you're in the shadow of the Rockies. And of course, as we know, air masses are deflected up, the western slopes of the Rockies, and then they release, most of the rain or snow, whatever's going to fall there. And so as the air comes down the eastern side, it's, largely dry. So we get a lot of deserts and near desert areas out in the plateaus that are near the Rockies. So that continues until you get here about to the middle of the country, and then you start to get more rain again, and we get into the tall grass prairie. Well, the Loess Hills are really interesting because they seem to be often just a little bit hotter and drier than most of the rest of Iowa during the summer. And in some ways, especially northwest Iowa here, might be just slightly colder, but possibly drier again. I know Mason City would dispute whether or not it's colder, but I'm not sure they'd dispute that it's drier. They get a lot of ice and snow that we often don't get. So I've seen, living here in Sioux City, I've seen a lot of storm systems either pass to our north or to our south. And so there are other parts of Iowa that get hit and we don't get hit. So it's interesting where it's slightly drier, you get this mixture. So for instance, ornithologists will come out of birders, will come out here because sometimes we get magpies here. Well, magpies are, again, Western species. We have the prairie rattlesnake out here, which is a Western shortgrass species. This is the easternmost. So this is as eastern as those species get because of kind of that dryness and also the loess soils. I mean, think about it, sand, the topsoils here are incredibly rich, but the sand is not necessarily good. So if the soil is removed, not a whole lot is going to grow. So obviously, just to the east of the Loess Hills, then you have the rest of Iowa. You have, the rich plains, the rolling prairie, and so you have all of those species. And so, yeah, this is kind of almost an ecotone where you get these, variable plant species as well as animal species coming here. And I didn't know that we had yucca, but then I went out to a local park and yeah, we have yucca here. I heard that we did. And I was like, I always associated that with more desert areas. But no, we got it right here.
Amazing. It's like we have a little bit of both, which is probably, not all states can say that. So I think
exactly.
Another reason why it's really important. And then another thing that we were looking at when we were putting together this presentation is that the area where the Little Sioux River meets the Missouri River is called a migratory corridor. What does that mean?
So the migration of, we'll focus on birds, but there are other migrations. some mammals will move to a certain extent, and of course bats will move to a certain extent. But there are major topographical features that many species at least use for part of their migrations. Migration becomes a very complicated thing. But the Missouri, when it branches off of the Mississippi, comes right up along the coast of Iowa, and it's basically going north-south there. So for any species that needs to go in kind of northward, southward, um, you know, migratory pathway, it's easy to follow the Missouri to get at least a few hundred miles. Now, the Little Sioux branches off of the Missouri, kind of right here in Sioux City, and goes up northeastern into Iowa. And Iowa is kind of a land of rivers. And it's thought that a lot of our rivers form migratory corridors for birds, to find their nesting sites. But then I'll also mention the Big Sioux River. If they want to go northwest, the Missouri goes west and forms, the northern boundary of Nebraska with the southern boundary of South Dakota. But if the birds want to keep going north, they follow the Big Sioux right up north. As far as I know, it's not known exactly, like to what percentage, how great that is. But there are a lot of birds that come through here. Obviously, the hills also then form great migratory pathways for raptors. But like even last year in my backyard bird feeder, I looked outside one day and I was like, that's a very large, that's a Harris's sparrow. This is an endangered species, and it's heading north to breed in Canada. And I had two of them stop over here at my backyard bird feeder. And it might be because, they're following this, amazing major pathway.
Wow, that's amazing. So I'm glad that you talked about all this, because I think it just really paints a picture in our mind of this incredible place here in our state. And I'm gonna switch this over to the not so great side of what's happening now. So as you know, and as probably most Sierra Club members know, that Iowa is one of the most altered states in the country. And historically, prairie covered 75 to 80% of our landscape. And now it's less than 0.1%, as I understand it. So it seems like we've kind of forgotten the importance of prairies. What benefits, like why, other than what you've spoken with about so far, like what other benefits that people might be able to see a direct impact on their lives, like flooding or anything like that? What benefits do they have for us? And have we attempted to protect this by making it a national park, kind of combining those two thoughts together?
Okay. Yep. The benefits of prairies are many and very similar to the benefits of many other wild spaces. First of all, there is more biomass in the root systems of prairie plants than there is above ground. That we find out is generally true even for forests. But what that means is a couple different things. First of all, it builds and stabilizes soils. So if you like to eat, you need good soils. It's the prairies that have given us the best soils in the world. This is unfortunately why we dug up all the prairie. But if we had an agriculture that more closely mimicked the prairie, it would be one that restores the landscape rather, than degrades and destroys the landscape. The other thing is that by having all that root mass in there, what happens is it traps a ton of biological matter. There's a whole soil ecosystem with a lot of different, small critters. Some you can see with your eye, like earthworms and pill bugs and that sort of thing, but many that are microscopic. And it turns out what's happening there, it's sequestering carbon. So if we actually had intact prairies, it would go a long way to help mitigate the effects of climate change. So that is one of the big reasons to help to restore prairies as well, because of the effects of climate change. Now, you mentioned the biological crossroads here. What types of species could we expect to see if we had intact prairies that were connected with each other? Well, people might be familiar with coyotes. They might not be as familiar with bobcats. We have them back in the Sioux City area now, and they've been coming back into Iowa. But historically, we had black bears here. Every now and then, grizzly bears would come down into northwest Iowa. That would truly be a sight. Obviously, we had wolves. We had elk. We had ginormous herds of bison. This was a biological treasure house. And that's what's largely gone away. So prairies are incredibly important for a whole host of species that need grasslands, that cannot otherwise, live in forests or on forest edges. The other thing that I'd like to say here is I always think about, who we are as people. It's why is anything else important? Well, I don't directly ask anyone this because it's too in your face, but I almost want to say, okay, so why are your children important? Why are your parents important? Why should you care? Well, it's because who we are as people. If we are a moral species, then we should care about all of the inhabitants that we share the land with. And that doesn't mean we can't use the land for our own purposes, but what it does mean is that ethically, we're going to place restraints on ourselves so that we don't kill off the other species. And we have gone way beyond that in Iowa in terms of the prairies. There's now so little prairie left that most prairie species, at best, have a very difficult time making a living here in Iowa.
Yeah, that's really sad. Because it's something that clearly that we should have pride in. It's something that if we look beyond, we see that the land in Iowa, its worth is just what can it produce in crops. But we forget that there are so many other things that we should value about places like this. And if not for direct impact reasons of protecting our soil and mitigating climate change, but also because it's the moral thing to do, like you said. I think that's really important.
Right. And even if you don't care about morals, I mean, there's so many psychological benefits, and it's been, documented now that psychological benefits for children to actually have meaningful experiences in nature, psychological benefits for adults. Even now, studies have showing just 1 to 2 hours going to a park or in nature every week, it helps you recover from the stresses of workday life, etc. And so, if we don't have these places, we're actually degrading ourselves, whether we think we are or not.
Right. That's a good point. People aren't always thinking about that. So I know in the past there were some attempts to make or to classify the Loess Hills as a national park.
Yes.
And I know it does have some special classification, but we didn't get that far. Why did we not get it to be classified as national park?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a report that was released by the National Park Service around about 20 years ago now. And basically it went like this. It's a national treasure. It's worthy of being included in the national park system, and it's 96% privately owned land. We're not touching that with a 10,000-foot pole. Good luck, Iowa. That was the thing. Way too much private land. We either have to be bought up or somehow condemned, by the federal or the state government in order to create a national park, and that's just a political nightmare. So that's kind of why it wasn't created. So instead, the Loess Hills Alliance was created with representatives from each of the 7 counties that the Loess Hills are in here in Western Iowa, and then that's funded by the state government, and then that's supposed to look at the conservation of the Loess Hills. Although unfortunately, we've seen over the last couple decades, funding has been cut for that.
I wonder, that makes me kind of think of Biden's 30 by 30 plan to conserve land. And I wonder how that could be utilized to protect the Loess Hills even more. Because I think they had plans for private and public land of how to get that conserved. So something to think about.
It would be great. I mean, look, private landowners, farmers, and others can put a certain percentage of their land in conservation reserve. And we can work with other partners, like professors, members of the Sierra Club and that, to help map out, okay, so if you take this portion of your farmland that actually isn't very productive to you because it's on a hillside or because it floods frequently or, something like that, then we put that in conservation reserve, then you have a little bit of income, and then the neighbor will do the same thing. And now we can have these corridors of natural lands through the Loess Hills, and no one has to sell their land. No one has to, give up, their property rights. That's something we could do if we thought about it and if we had the will to do it. Again, to me, that's a moral thing to do. That's if we are, a moral species, we'll do that. because like I go out into Loess Hills and I go biking through the Loess Hills, and then you see corn being grown on the slope, and it's like, why are you growing corn on a Loess Hill slope? As soon as, I mean, first of all, obviously on any slope, the topsoil erodes very quickly. And as soon as the topsoil is gone, then that exposes the loess, and then the whole hill can come down. It's ridiculous. And I've seen huge gullies through the loess in various areas around here. It's like we need to do things differently. And if we start to restore some of the land, it's actually better in the long run anyway.
Yeah,
For us as well as
absolutely.
all the other species.
It kind of reminds me, it's like the same story across the state in the driftless region, where we're seeing an incredibly precious, the karst terrain up there. I mean, something that we really
Yeah.
need to protect. We have algific talus slopes that have endangered species. We have cold water trout streams, sinkholes. All of these important things that we need to protect in Northeast Iowa. But it's the same story of where so like agriculture is impeding on the landscape and potentially harming it for the long term. And I think one thing that we're really trying to get across here at Sierra Club is that we're always told that it's either the environment or agriculture. And we don't believe that it has to be that way. We think that we can have both. We can have agriculture that actually protects the environment. And so it just kind of seems like this is something that we need to think about holistically across the state, because whether it's the western side or the eastern side, the way we are farming right now is not protecting the things that we care about, and it can protect the things we care about.
Exactly. I mean, one of the things that we're talking about is, let's look at the marginal lands. They really aren't that good for agriculture to begin with. Why can't we start to restore those to more natural areas? We shouldn't be farming those. I mean, we can ask just basic questions. Where are the good places to farm? Where are bad places to farm? Oh, those are bad places to farm. Let's no longer farm those. Let's, and it doesn't have to happen right away, but over time, over a period of years, we can actually start to restore. Really, it's more of a balance to our lives. It's not a balance in ecology. We need to ask, when is enough? When have we taken up enough land for our purposes? When have we produced enough food in Iowa? And if we're going to produce food in Iowa, that's the other thing that we need to ask, because we grow corn and soybeans. Why?
Right.
Because we're feeding animals. We're not feeding humans.
Right.
And it goes for animal feed. You got the richest soils in the world right here in Iowa. How about we grow human food? Why aren't we growing strawberries? Why aren't we growing watermelon? Why aren't we growing cauliflower? We could.
Right. Right.
These are all choices that we're making, and we could say, hey, you want locally grown food? We should be eating locally grown food throughout Iowa.
Right. Right. I completely agree with that. That is, that just always baffles me of, we need to feed the world, but what food? What food are we growing?
Right. So why do you go to the supermarket and you buy your vegetables from California? I mean, it's why,
Yeah, I know, makes no sense. Well, before we get to a couple questions from some people that we have on Facebook, is there anything that you want to add that we haven't discussed yet?
Probably a lot, but I probably shouldn't go too in detail about that. One of the things I think that is a thought that comes off of the idea of agriculture changing the landscape. There's another change that probably a lot of people don't realize. Again, historically, prairies were on the ridge tops of the Loess Hills, and the forests were down in the valleys along the streams and the rivers. Well, with family farming in the late 1800s to early 1900s, Iowa has been flying planes, at least since the 1930s, over Iowa and taking photographs. We've seen a change here, which is now there are a lot more forests on the hilltops. And so that's an ecological change as well. Well, why? Because what do you do when you build a farmhouse, in Iowa? Well, you want that tree line, especially to the northwest of your house, so that those cold winter winds don't take all the heat away. Well, then the problem is those little woodlots were largely unmanaged through the last century or so. And so where the forests are and where any remaining prairie is has changed throughout the last century or so here in Iowa. So that's another thing we might want to address at some point.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. So somebody's asking here, so there's something about mining these hills for fill dirt.
Yeah.
Like that sounds like a horrible idea. What does that mean and what impacts that going to have?
Yeah, I'm not incredibly up on the law, but my understanding is that the loess itself is supposed to be protected by law, but the problem is that the size of the grains correspond to what is called silt in soils. So if someone digs up a Loess Hill, they're not supposed to be able to do that without permits, is my understanding of the law. Again, I could be wrong here, but that's my understanding. However, once the hill's dug up and that soil sent somewhere else, you can even ask an expert, okay, what is this? And most experts are not going to be able to tell the difference between, loess particles and regular silt. So the problem is you have essentially these enormous mounds that we call hills of silts. And so they can just be mined, yeah, exactly, for fill dirt for elsewhere. And if it's not regulated and it's not enforced, we can lose the Loess Hills one hill at a time.
That's not good. Not good at all. Hopefully that's something that we can work on legislatively or however we need to do that to protect it. Okay, last question. This is the goal is to get some people out there and interested in taking a day trip over to Western Iowa. Tell us what we will see, hear, and smell, or anything else that we would expect to experience if we visited.
The first thing is a topography that's unlike the rest of Iowa. What you need to do is come out here and really go on top of the Loess Hills, especially Northwest Iowa. That's where we have the largest hills. And what you'll see, it almost looks like the foothills of mountains. It's really a beautiful landscape. And sometimes just like coming back from a trip or something, I just crest a hill and just look at Sioux City, and then you see all of the hills, both in the background, beyond the city, and within the city, and you just like the beauty is amazing. There's the scenic byway out here, by the way, that you can travel, designated route that will actually show you this. What will you hear? Lots of birds, lots of different types of birds that you may not be as used to. You'll see a lot of raptors in the air. And of course, you will easily see a lot of mammals, deer, raccoons, lots of things around. On my bike ride last night, I just scared up 3 deer right next to the road because they're in, the tall grasses, and I didn't even see them until suddenly you hear this huge rustling next to you, and then they're gone. Now you'll also see a lot of agriculture like you see throughout the rest of the state. And so those are also parts of the sights and smells around here. But if people in the rest of the state don't know what a retaining wall is, it's interesting to come to our human settlements. You'll learn what a retaining wall is, because when you cut through the loess, you have to put in a barrier to keep the hill up. And so throughout all the settlements here, we have, stone or railroad ties or something holding up, the part of the hill that the building cut through. So you'll see a lot of that too.
Yeah, and that makes me think too, because I've been out in the area a few times, and the farming looks different there too because it's so hilly. You see a lot more terracing,
Yes.
which I'm sure there are probably places where you're seeing that where that place just shouldn't be farmed at all. But it is kind of interesting to just see different practices used for agriculture out there as well.
Yeah, lots of terracing, lots of like strips of grass, so that when you do get runoff, then the soils are kind of retained in that strip of grass, that sort of thing. Lots of that out here. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, David. We really appreciate this conversation. And I now want to go drive up the scenic byway because I haven't done that. I've been up in the area and looked around, but I haven't driven the byway. So
Yeah, I recommend.
Hopefully other people are inspired to do that too.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today.
Yeah, you're welcome. And thank you everyone for tuning in to our weekly Friday Lunch and Learns. We'll be back on next Friday. We actually have an exciting one next Friday with Neil Hamilton from Drake University talking about water quality. And then also please visit the sierraclub.com/Iowa. Click on our calendar. We have 2 exciting webinars coming up. On the 23rd, we're going to be doing a webinar on installing solar for schools. And then on the 29th, we're going to be doing a webinar on supreme beef and how we're sacrificing our water for CAFO. So get involved, tune in, share this with your friends, and we will see you next Friday. Thanks again, David.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.